right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve, I got a Play-Doh discussion for the poem Ozymandias, as well as a writing workshop. So what does that mean? A Play-Doh discussion is a gamified version of a hybrid concoction of a Fishbowl, Harkness discussion, and Socratic seminar. In my estimation, it takes the good parts of those three discussion modalities and gamifies it and gets us into an edutainment exercise. So I'm going to model how to do that and how to run that show. And then I'm going to do what I typically do in my videos, run you through a writing workshop. How can kids cobble together an essay based on the poem Ozymandias while pulling the strings of my template? This was a popular request. I did a workshop about a year ago with the National Writing Project on this, and we seem to have lost the recording, and probably about 6 or 7, 8 emails I got this week asking for that recording. So I said, I'll just re-record it and put it in the YouTube channel. Speaking about that YouTube channel, please subscribe. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross at composition, and you can download every single slide that you will see in this presentation, all the discussion questions and all these exemplars that you'll have for the writing workshop in terms of the inverted thesis heuristic and the syllogistic method heuristic. The whole essay will be there for you in the slides. Just look in the description below. So let's talk about why I gamify. In my district, I just find that, I don't know, like COVID kind of killed the traditional classroom discussion for me. Kids don't participate. Oftentimes they're monopolized by 1, 2, 3 students. And by default, I do something that my mentor teacher in graduate school referred to as wagon wheeling. And here's what I mean by that. It's kind of a cool analogy. Teacher asks questions, and then like a spoke on a wheel, it goes to one student gives the answer back to the teacher. Teacher, validates or corrects and responds. Another question goes out. Another student responds. And it's just kind of a very teacher-centric discussion modality. And it doesn't work that well. And I never really feel successful as a teacher when I engage in wagon wheeling. So a Play-Doh discussion gamifies certain aspects of those discussions, but the big thing is this: it gets the students to ask the questions of the text. And that's the kicker. Good readers ask good questions. And it kind of teaches them how to question a text, ascertain meaning in a text, which translates over very well into their writing. So let me tell you how I gamify it. Just give you a couple of ideas of how you can do this in your classroom. I have this exact tic-tac-toe diagram here on my whiteboard. I bought it on Amazon for like $5.99. And it's a magnetic tic-tac-toe board that you can attach to any whiteboard. And I just split the class in teams of 2, XO, and we answer their questions. And I'm kind of the talk show host. I'm the referee, if you will. And it's really cool. I like the element of collaboration and competition. Kids get really into it, and sometimes it gets a little saucy and a little sassy. And it creates great classroom rapport, too, when kids engage each other like that. A couple of others that have worked well for me: we use Connect 4, we use Jenga, and I know in the Facebook groups, a lot of teachers are having huge success with Jenga. I tend to use the colored version ones and basically just do strata numbers on the colors. So like if the kid pulls a purple, it's like a 10-point question. Green's a 50-point question. You can gamify it that way. If I want to have smaller teams, I do Hungry Hungry Hippos, where you have an orange, a yellow, a pink, and a green team, and then basically the point value of the question is determined on how many marbles are gobbled. And if you want to get into the minutia and the exactitude of that, just drop me an email and I can pass along some of the rules that I've set up. I wouldn't be so exacting. Just have fun, let it rip. You know your audience better than me. Each individual class is different based on the kids who arrive. So just have fun with it. So I already alluded to this. Good readers ask good questions. And I'm going to show you in a second here the questions that NWP teachers asked of Ozymandias. So they were my students. I treated them like, high school students just to show them how to run these activities. So these are actually really good, juicy questions that you can use with your students. But the goal is to get students to generate these questions on their own, which of course takes a lot of modeling and a lot of practicing. So without further ado, let's take a look at the types of questions that ultimately we want our kids to be asking so that it's less teacher centric. So number one, the form and structure are very important to the overall meaning and construction of the poem. Explain and identify and get your nose in the text, right? So the form and the structure is huge in this, right? The kids, can't overlook the fact that it's a stanza and, it's pretty loaded. So that's kind of a standard question for Ozymandias. Here's another one. Number two, operating from the premise that everything is deliberate and intentional in this poem, why did Shelley employ this particular rhyme scheme? How does it construct meaning in the work as a whole? So one of the things that we were working on as a group in the National Writing Project, teachers we're all kind of on the same page saying it's really difficult to teach kids to read for tight syntactical analysis. So a number of these questions in this deck here get at some real hardcore cutthroat syntax questions. Number three, as we know, oftentimes poets will manipulate sound devices to advance the universal truth of their work. Explain and identify how the sound devices work in this poem. So you can imagine kids working collaboratively, putting their heads together, kind of hemming and hawing and tussling and grappling with these questions. These are juicy. These got some pith to it. So these are really, really good questions to get to the heart of the poem. Number four, the word trunkless is very pregnant. Unpack its significance in terms of how it lends meaning to the work as a whole. And most of the questions that I ask my students get to authorial intent and construction of meaning. And you'll see in the writing workshop in just a second that those are two key questions to the thesis statement. So this is very intentional. Number five, the poem pivots upon the various forms of irony at play. Explore this idea in determining the things the sculptor of the statue read and how they survive. So, lines 6 through 7. And it's a hard question, and we really want to be exact with this. So, we give a hint to the kids. Hint, you need to make a key syntactical observation in line 6. So, that sixth line is some syntactical majesty there. So, have them check that out. All right. And now, number 6 says, on a denotative and connotative level, also literal and figurative, what do you think that hand and heart are? Going one step further, in what sense might they mock and feed? Bonus point, what rhetorical device is being employed here? And we'll skip to number 7. So I know teachers are very familiar with Ozymandias. I think when we were doing this, one of the teachers in the group said it's the most commonly taught poem in the American high school curriculum. So I don't feel compelled to answer these for you. I think, teachers are very familiar with this poem. Number 7, who are the words on the pedestal addressing? Perform tight diction analysis. What's really being said? And that kind of gets to the essence of it, right? That's a good question right there. You got to ask that one. Number 8, how might the audience's despair stray from the original implications of the implied words? Right, you got to get to the irony here. Name that device, term, technique. So ultimately, I want my kids to, unpack the various forms of irony in this poem. Number 9, what contrast or contrast does the speaker draw between the statue's original form and its current state? Use the text to help support your answer. So we put that little clause at the bottom of a lot of questions. Use the text to help support your answer so that the kids aren't talking around the text. They get their nose in it and they're drawing their textual support because that's an exercise that ultimately will transfer over into their writing. Number 10, what is the universal theme of the poem and what role does tone play in articulating these themes? And lastly, big idea question. Why do you suppose Shelley chose to frame the narrative around the observations of an anonymous traveler? So, those are the questions that we grappled with in the Plato's Plato discussion. And when we're done, the kids have a good sense of how the poem operates, what it means, how it means. So, what we got to do next is write the essay. So, you got to ask yourself the question when you're writing an essay, the obvious question. So, how do I write the introduction? And those that are familiar with my work, you know that I always, for literary analysis, say use that inverted thesis heuristic. But there's a caveat to this, and this is what I was teaching my NWP colleagues. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. Teachers fall very short in their practice when they merely assign writing. It needs to be explicitly taught. And I think Bob Ross did a very good job of demonstrating for English teachers how we should do our craft. Number one, he used heuristics. He used something called the wet on wet technique. And you've already heard me use that word heuristics. And basically, it's a scaffold, it's a training wheel, it's a structure to help our kids be really cogent and logical in their writing, really flesh out and develop their ideas. And he'd get to the canvas and the easel and he'd paint with and for us, and we could approximate what he was doing. He's the expert. And again, note, he never dumbed it down, so we don't want to dumb it down either. So when I get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint with and for my students, I use heuristics. I either declare or invert the thesis and use a particular heuristic for that. And when I move into the body paragraphs, I use something called the syllogistic method heuristic, which I will model in just a second. All right, I got some breaking news for you though. If we were to take any prompt from FRQ2 or FRQ1 from the AP literature exam, any poetry prompt, there are two implicit questions in those prompts, and they are as such. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? Our entire introductory paragraph is going to hinge upon how we answer those two questions. So let's graphically look at what the inverted thesis looks like, and I'll unpack all the parts at play in this. So the very first question, what is the authorial intent, gets three sentences, right? And when you ask authorial intent, some teachers use different language. So they might talk about universal theme, the exigence, the universal truth. So you take three sentences to get to that. And then the last sentence comprises the thesis statement. That's why we call this an inverted thesis. You end with the thesis. Whenever a student answers the question, how does the author construct meaning? That constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. So it's three sentences authorial intent, one sentence construction of meaning. But there's other bit parts in here. There's other players. Students should have, sufficient ample tier 2 level vocabulary. All I mean by that is your average run of the mill SAT level caliber words. Don't goon out, don't overdo it. Don't think that, good writing is using $1 million words. That's not the point. You just have to augment the vocab to sound academic. The other thing that I focus on a lot in my Nuance Academy are the sentence constructs. And I won't belabor this. I have a ton of stuff in my YouTube channel if you want to do a deeper dive into this. I rely heavily on a text by Strunk and White called Write It Right. And they have something called Rule Number 18, in which they make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence, but then there are 20 ways to pattern those sentences. So at sentence level, I want my students to be syntactical ninjas, to cultivate good voice rhythm and flow. And you know this. I'm not saying anything new here. You guys have been teaching long enough. You know that young, struggling, emerging writers will over rely on independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. So their tone is like da 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 da. So those sentence constructs, when we explicitly teach them, break that rhythm. So let's recap this before I show you exemplars. 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Here is the first one. I'll just read it through from top to bottom, and then I'll pick it apart and show you everything that's involved in it. When one thumbs their nose at the eternal rules of God, it is them that look the fool in the end. With grave error, Ozymandias forgot this fundamental understanding in his lifetime. In spite of his accomplishments here on earth, they were rendered to the same fate as every man upon his passing. We all end up in the same place, dead and decaying. Shelley conveys this truth through situational and verbal irony and buttresses the concept by manipulating an irregular rhyme scheme. And I should have said this before. The teachers wrote these, students of mine in the National Writing Project. So you're looking at teacher exemplars. First three sentences. Do you hear how that's all just universal truth? And then the last sentence, you're like, oh, all right, construction of meaning. You got to use your terms, devices, techniques. Yup. So when you get to the construction of meaning, I always tell students to focus on the salient, most germane, most relevant terms, devices, techniques in there. And, this teacher went with the idea of the ironies and then the rhyme schemes, which is a fair thesis. So 3+1, the vocab is up. There's some cooking sentence constructs in here. Even that third sentence has the double dash, which is really cool. So that might be a little pie in the sky and cloudy and nebulous in the ether. So let's do it again. Let's take a look at teacher number 2. Again, I'll just read it and then I'll unpack it. An essential tenet of life is that it is fleeting and that at some point in time we will meet our final day. It is only those with unchecked egos that believe that they can defy this natural law of order. In spite of his bravado, the test of time delivers this truth to the great Ozymandias in that he experiences the shared fate of every living creature, great or small. Shelley, through all three paradigms of irony, conveys the plight of one man's sheer hubris. So again, last sentence is the thesis. You spy with your little eye the terms, the devices, the techniques. The first three sentences are driven by the concept of the universal truth, the exigence, right? The theme of it. All right. Yes, you can do this. It's very easy. I know some teachers look at this and say, my kids can never do that. You got to practice it and you got to Bob Ross it in order to make the magic happen. Here's number 3. And for my students, I always model 3 times. No life is immortal, no matter the accomplishments one experiences here on earth. In fact, regardless of life experience, all life comes from dust and returns to the dust of the earth in spite of one's willpower to reverse this common fate. No matter the wealth, fame, or fortune one has accumulated during their lifetime, the inescapable truth is that death renders all for naught. Shelley touches upon this idea by manipulating a variety of ironies and a forced rhyme scheme. Same thing every time. It's always 3+1. Easy peasy. And then, when you get into the videos on my sentence constructs, like one of the things the teacher did in the third sentence was a pattern called a trio. Right. No matter the wealth, 1, fame, 2, fortune, 3. So patterning like that. My students learn all of those techniques and little, flares of the pencil. All right. If you're writing with me, pause here and give the 3+1 a whirl. Moving on, because we still got a lot of canvas left. You got to ask yourself the question. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And because I've already told you, you're going to proceed syllogistically. I'm going to give a real cursory overview of this because I talk about it a lot in my channel. And I'll just give you a working understanding, a working knowledge of the syllogistic method. So it comes from Aristotle. It's from the Aristotelian tradition. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would throw out their own juicy essential questions. And you might know this one if you've ever read Plato's Republic. What is justice? And the great philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition. And Aristotle noted that some of his students were all over the place. They couldn't sustain a line of reasoning. He's like, how do I teach cogency? How do I teach them to be logical? And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, aha, the syllogistic method. I can basically teach them to think very mathematically, computatively. His word was cogently, logically. And all a syllogism is when you argue from premise, conclusion. So you might say something like this. Premise number 1, arsenic is deadly. Like if I were to say that to you, you would all nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you're right. If I follow it up with a second premise that states, my dog ate arsenic, do you see how you naturally conclude here, logically, cogently? Kristian, your dog's going to die. Like, it's not going to bode well for your dog. Sorry for the morbid example, but that is an example of line of reasoning, something that we talk about in composition all the time. Aristotle referred to that as cogency. So how do we morph that heuristic into a heuristic to perform literary analysis? Check it out. The first premise is going to be an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. It's a 3-sentence move, and I'll model it for you. I like students to take 3 sentences because you'll see it'll allow them space to multitask. And here's what I mean by that. We don't want students to write 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax. That's too plotting, too dutiful, and they definitely, will not get the sophistication point writing like that. So in taking 3 sentences, students have space to begin to see how the terms, devices, techniques intersect with each other to create larger meanings. So now we're talking about that concept of complexity that we're always referencing. Second premise starts at the 4th sentence, and it's a teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. And then we need to be mindful that we just can't end on a quote, right? You can't abandon a body paragraph at a quote. You got to tag a conclusion on it. And this is just the links, the echoes, the promises. You got to go back to the prompt. You got to go back to the thesis. Keep the promise of the first premise. All right, enough of me talking about it. Let me show you. You might be asking, what's that first premise look like, Kristian? I got you covered. Here it is. I'll just read it and then I'll break it down. Right from the onset, the narrator introduces the central irony of the piece by shifting the focus onto the anecdote of the traveler. Through the slow enumeration of Ozymandias' character, the narrator builds the drama of the situation in order to deliver the ultimate punchline. Even the forced rhyme scheme helps to aid in the development of the delivery. So you might be saying, all right, this is interesting. But here's the thing. My students often ask good questions, and one question is this: where do I begin my body paragraph? And you see that this student, and again, it's a teacher wrote this, it's not one of my students, it's a student from my National Writing Project class, so a teacher. I told my students in NWP and even my own students in the classroom to use this clause right from the onset, comma. It indicates to your reader that you have a chronology, you have a sequence. And I really like it when students are very methodical in their analysis and they're not discursive and tangential in how they proceed through a piece. So right from the onset, cues the reader into knowing that you are going to be very calculative in your execution. And then you can see here, this student just dropped in some terms, devices, techniques that we're going to focus on in this paragraph. And they're all the relevant terms, devices, techniques that are up top in the poem, like the upper third of the poem, right? So from here, what I usually do when I write is say this: what's the promise of the first premise? And we know we got to explore the irony, the enumeration, right? We got to take a look at some thematic concepts and even some syntactical features. So I go textual support hunting. I go get all my quotes and paraphrases that I need to keep the promise of that first premise. And that's the kicker, right? To sustain a cogent line of reasoning, you got to keep the promise of the first premise. Whatever you talked about in that first premise, in the second premise, you still got to be talking about it, and you can't talk about anything else. So let's see where this teacher went. So second premise starts at the 4th sentence. Here it is. Immediately, the ABAB arrangement forces the B pattern in that stone and frown do not rhyme exactly. Placing the emphasis on the stone frown is ironic because Ozymandias would definitely be frowning could he pull back the veil of time to see his hapless state of being. His mighty works did not withstand the test of time and eternally endure in the sense that his ego is forever propped up. Instead, his visage comes to know the decay of the colossal wreckage and cruel knowingness that God's hand comes to smite all sense of someone's inflated ego. Ozymandias' bravado is ironically rendered comical. He's now witnessing that all life diminishes itself to become the lone and level sands that stretch far away into a shared human fate. All right. So there are quotes and paraphrases for everything that was stipulated in that first premise. And one of the things that I teach is a heuristic within the heuristic. I call it the 5-word rule. If students place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, it's typical. It usually works. So 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote relatively small. It should sound conversational. You see in this exemplar here that there's some bracketing going on. I teach kids how to bracket so that everything sounds conversational. But we're not done. We got to conclude the thought, right? Syllogisms are circles in a sense. So usually a conclusion to the syllogism takes about 2 or 3 sentences. Look what this teacher did. No matter how great one is during their time spent here on earth, fate brings one back to the humbling reality that we are all bound by the eternal rules. Death is inevitable. But Shelley even takes it one step further. Oftentimes, a mighty man thinks he's mighty simply through the acquisition of mighty possessions. The couplet reminds us of this truth. It's all for naught once you perish this earth. All right, if you're writing with me, pause, give it a roll, 3 plus 1. But we got to ask ourselves the question, what do I do next? And it's quite easy. You literally just bust out another syllogism. So we're at the top third of the poem. You have to ask yourself what's left. What terms, devices, techniques have we not analyzed as of yet? And then you move from that, middle portion of the poem down to the bottom. And typically my students do 4 paragraphs, especially for the AP exam. So for AP Lit and AP Lang, they only write 4 paragraphs. Intro, first syllogism is the first body paragraph, second syllogism is the second body paragraph, and then a conclusion. So let me give you an example of how you would move on. I'll just show you the first premise, and then you guys can figure out the rest. It's pretty self-explanatory. So this is the first premise of what a second body paragraph might look like. The epitaph creates an ironic juxtaposition between Ozymandias' sheer arrogance and bravado in contrast to the harsh realities of the human condition. No matter one's accomplishments in life, man is rendered to the same shared fate. Even the alternating rhyme scheme reinforces the central conflict. Ozymandias' huge ego coming into collision with the reality of the human condition. So it's always 3 sentences, and you can see here you got ample space to multitask, right? So like, what's this juxtaposition got going on with the conflict, with the rhyme scheme, etc. All those terms, whether you explicitly or implicitly state them, are interconnected, linked up, jigsaw connected in this. All right, so that takes us through intro, body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2. How do you wrap the essay up? I use early in the year conclusion stems, and I ultimately I want my kids weaned off this, especially my AP literature kids. I don't let them do this come time of the exam unless they absolutely need it. And I equate the conclusion of an essay to like a fireworks display. You always have a grand finale at the end of a fireworks display, and the conclusion is akin to the grand finale. So you're hammering home the big universal truths, the themes, the exigences. So I like these little transitions like this, these stems. You could begin simply said, boom, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, in a global sense. And again, my students take about 3 or 4 sentences for the conclusion. All right, I'm reaching the end. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, feel free to drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I'm doing all sorts of professional development at late. I'm doing things with Perfection Learning, the National Writing Project, even applied practice. I've been doing a lot of individual consulting, going to districts, working one-on-one with teachers, and I even started a tutoring company called Write at Ivy Write that you can tell your students about. So I'm helping them with their college personal statements. I used to work admissions at Brown, so I'm really good with personal statements and the supplements. So if you want to work one-on-one with me, if you would like to do that, you want me to push in with your department, I can do that. And if you want to stay abreast of my comings and goings, in the land of Zoom and the land of the internet, you can visit my website, www.teachingwritingcoach.com, and I have a calendar of events. So most of those webinars are free. Some of the PD is a nominal fee. I think we definitely don't charge as much as a lot of other places. So just check that out. And if you got any questions, drop me an email. I'll keep the writing workshops coming. I hope that served you well and it's useful. Take care.